Darryl, thanks for joining us today. Excited to have you on the Meat Mafia podcast, man.
Brett, Harry, so glad to be here. Thanks for letting me be a part of your show today.
Yeah, we're really pumped. We were saying prior to hitting record that this is a cool episode for us because we've used Redmond Real Salt I think I've used your product since like 2018, 2019. I first discovered you guys in New York for the first time. And when I was going carnivore and keto, low carb, you were a big part in fueling that journey, just because I know a lot of people, when they transition to low carb, they really need to keep that salt intake and that sodium intake up. And we didn't even realize that your grandfather was actually the founder of Redmond. So we're just excited to learn more about your story, your family story, and do a really good episode just focused on salt, because it's such an important aspect of nutrition that's misunderstood.
You know, I like that word misunderstood, because for thousands of years, salt sustained life. It was a source of trade. The term salary is because Roman soldiers were paid a wage in salt. And the term "is a man worth his salt" was because they were paid in salt. And if you weren't working hard enough to earn your keep, then you weren't worth your salt. And so salt has always been essential for life. It was a source of trade. Every civilization started around access to the salt deposits. Every war has always had salt as a focus, because if the military doesn't have salt, or the animals that are involved in the military conflict don't have salt, everything starts to fall apart. In order of importance, you have oxygen. Of course, if the air was sucked out of the room, we'd realize real quick how important that was. And then water would be the second, and then the third would be salt. And so those three things are essential. But yet for 100 years or so, we would hear health professionals say, hey, salt's bad for you, eat less salt. But for all time, it was so essential. In fact, when you go to the hospital, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to give you an IV of saline solution, which is salt water. Doesn't matter if you have high blood pressure, it doesn't matter what you have. When you go to the hospital, your IV will not be distilled water. It will not be tap water. It's not going to be coffee, although that sounds good at 7 in the morning.
Yeah, we'll take it.
But salt is such a big part of us, and yet people have heard that salt's bad. And so hopefully today we can kind of talk about some of those misconceptions and how that happened.
Yeah, I think that would be really great to kind of understand where the narrative started to shift. And we'd also love to dive, into the story of Redmond. But, you mentioned just kind of like salt getting this bad reputation about 100 years ago. Was there something that changed in the dietary guidelines, or just like the nutrition world, that started to make people think differently about salt?
Yeah, that's a great question, because if you think about humans, before we had a refrigerator, one of your taglines is eat local, eat real, and make it yourself. Well, once we got the refrigerator, we started to eat differently. Before the refrigerator, all of us would have eaten more salt, because if we were eating meat outside of season, it would have been preserved in salt. So we would have used, jerkies, and we would have used, smoking and processes like that. But salt is hygroscopic, and which means it sucks water out of the air. So salt is used in preserving meats because it sucks the blood and the moisture out. And salt is also used to preserve vegetables. So if we were to have any vegetables outside of season, it would have been sauerkraut, kimchi, fermented veggies that would have been preserved with salt. And so although historically our ancestors would have eaten more salt, it wasn't until the 1950s that all of a sudden that salt was seen as this bad thing. So I can send you a copy of this, but there's an article. It was 1954, and it was published, and the title is Evidence for Relationship Between Sodium Chloride Intake and Human Essential Hypertension. Kind of an interesting study. And salt's job in the body is to help regulate intercellular and extracellular fluids. That's one of the hundreds of things salt does in the body. That's a pretty important one, because in the cell, there's a sodium potassium pump, and it helps pull the fluid inside and outside of the cell. It cleans the cell. It transfers nutrition. It transfers toxins. One of the salt's main jobs in the body. And so the hypothesis was that because salt helps regulate fluid, if you eat high amounts of salt, it'll mess up the way that fluid is retained, which can then put more pressure on the blood, and it can do all these kind of things. And so these scientists, they took copious amounts of processed salt and injected it into these mice. And sure enough, at super high levels, salt does have this impact. But in nature, nobody takes salt that way. If you look at animals, animals don't overdose on salt. They'll drink water and then they'll find access to salt because they listen to their bodies. And just like you and I, if we were to just drink, 3 or 4 gallons of water today, we might start having something called hyponatremia because we're going to flush all of the salt and the minerals and electrolytes out of our body. And so just like taking too much water, taking too much salt does cause a whole slew of problems. But it's not the salt that's doing it. It's the way that it was administered. And so this study, because it was published in 1950, that kind of gave the rise of salt is bad. Just like years ago, there was a study that said fat was bad. And all of a sudden, everybody jumps on this low-fat diet, thinking that all fat is created equal and all fat's bad for us. But yet, we know that fat now, for our brains and for our eyes and for almost every organ, fat is actually essential for life. Now, not the fat that you might get on a donut. And salt's the same way. And the nature of salt, by the time this study was published in the 1950s, the nature of salt changed.
Interesting. Wow, I did not know that, and I'm curious too, Darryl. One of the things you mentioned was processed salt that was getting injected into these rats, and I'm just curious: is there a massive difference between like the iodized table salt that you'll find at like a McDonald's or a restaurant versus like mineral salt or sea salt like you all are using at Redmond?
There is, and there's actually, and we can talk about this in a minute, but there's 3 really good questions I think your listeners can ask themselves when they're looking for a good, clean salt. And it's pretty simple. And these 3 questions, I think, will also help you find good, clean products, whether it's salt or butter or, ghee or whatever it is that you're sourcing. So the difference in salt, so salt in the oceans occurs as a complex chloride. If you went out to the ocean water, that ocean water, it does have sodium and chloride, and that's the predominant chloride. But there's also potassium chloride, magnesium chloride, calcium chloride, selenium, zinc, copper, phosphorus, iodine, a whole slew of elements and minerals that occur in seawater. And so if we went back several thousand years ago and we looked at the way salt was produced, we would go out to the ocean. Maybe it was the San Francisco Bay, the Gulf of Mexico, the Sea of Japan. And we would bring the seawater into a pond. And we would line that pond with clay. Because if we bring the water and put it on sand, the salt and the water just seeps back into the sand. But if we line that pond with clay, it creates a barrier so the salt and the water can't fall out of suspension. Seawater is about 3% sodium and chloride, salt, not just sodium and chloride, but 3% salt. Our bodies are about 0.9%. So the reason that when you go in the ocean, it stings your eyes is because the ocean is 2 to 3 times more salty than our bodies are. So if we bring that seawater in, it's 3%. And then we start evaporating the water off. It goes to 4 to 5 to 6, 7. Max salinity is 23%, 24% is max salinity. So as soon as you get enough water off, evaporated, then the salt crystals will start to fall out of suspension because the water can't hold any more than about 26%, depending on the air temperature and the elevation, sodium and chloride. So what happens is then we go out and we take a rake and we rake up those salt crystals and we get all of the complex chlorides as well as some of the minerals from that clay. And that's what gives us a product like the French gray salt. And the reason it's gray is because of that gray clay lined pond and because all the minerals were settled off together in its completeness. And the French gray products are a good salt. You have a similar process in Hawaii, and they use red clay. So the reason there's this red Hawaiian salt is because they bring the water in off the coast of Hawaii, and it's a red clay lined pond. And so that's how salt was always created. Or you might find an ancient seabed, like the pink salt that comes out of the Himalayas, Pakistan region, the pink salt that comes out of Utah, the pink salt that comes out of Bolivia. These are prehistoric seabeds that went through that same process, but it was done by nature. And so in all of time, up until, more recent 100 years or so, that's how salt was collected. Well, about the turn of the century, salt companies realized that through a series of evaporation ponds and processes, they could take the seawater from the ocean, bring it into the first pond, and they could leach out the potassium chloride. Then they can move the water to the next pond with a different membrane, different liner, and they could pull out the calcium chloride, move it to the next pond, pull out the magnesium chloride. So through a series of evaporation ponds, they could start to pull off some of these other elements. And it wasn't, I don't think, seen as something bad. I think, if we had an orange farm down in Florida and we came up with a new process that we could extract the vitamin C out of an orange and sell it to a supplement company, and we could still sell the orange in the supermarket, boy, we're geniuses. Mm-hmm. But the question is, should we do that? And I think that's when the nature of salt started to change. So that was the first process that started to change salt, was this demineralization. Mm-hmm. The second problem, which I think is actually a bigger problem, because those other minerals, it's a small percentage. In most natural salts, you have about 2%, 3% of these other trace minerals, and you're still 97, 98% sodium and chloride with these trace elements. And they're important elements, but they're not a dietary source. The second bigger problem with most salts today is salt, as you remember, I said, is hygroscopic, meaning it sucks water out of the air. So if I have a salt crystal like this one, and I put it on my kitchen table or even hold it in my hands, it's going to start getting wet because it's actually drawing water to it. The problem with that is if you put salt in a shaker, and you have salt in a shaker here, and it's drawing water out of the air, that salt now gets wet and it gets sticky, and so it doesn't want to flow out of the shaker very well. So some people will put rice, crystals or grains of rice in their salt shaker, or you might need to tap it to break up those clumps. Well, some chemists got together and said, what chemical could we add to the salt that we could paint that crystal with, coat it with, that would stop the salt's ability to interact with moisture? And so what chemicals can we cover this with to stop its ability to interact with moisture? Without stopping to think, salt's job is to interact with moisture. And so they came up with a whole list of chemicals, things like yellow prussiate of soda, which is sodium ferrocyanide, one called calcium silicoaluminate, which is very similar to antiperspirant type anti-moisture chemical, propylene glycol 400, which is a chemical that displaces and repels moisture. And so now a lot of these salts have these chemicals that are added to stop the salt's ability to interact with moisture. One of the most innovative marketing campaigns of the day was a little girl with an umbrella, and it's raining, and she's got a little salt shaker that's pouring out salt out of the back as she walks down the street. And the tagline is, when it rains, it pours. Because when it's rainy and humid, the salt will still pour out of your shaker. Really cute marketing campaign. But the problem with that is it changes the nature of salt. And if you were to take 2 licks of your antiperspirant every morning before breakfast, you're going to have some problems. And so now, instead of this salt being this life-giving thing that every civilization since the dawn of time has valued, it was given as wages, it was given as a source of trade, it was given as wedding gifts, is now this chemical substance that's had different elements removed, that's has chemicals added. And if you look at your ingredient list on a lot of salts, it'll have 3 or 4 ingredients, including dextrose. And, why is dextrose in salt? Well, we used to say just a spoonful of sugar helps the bad salt go down. But what it's really in there for is because it's a stabilizer. And some of these other chemicals that are added to salt will turn yellow or turn off colors over time. And by adding sugar to your salt, you actually can slow down that process and extend the shelf life. And so anytime, and the simplest thing when it comes to salt, people will say, oh, Darryl, I've heard sea salt's better. Unfortunately, that's not the case anymore. And if you walk into a health food store or you're shopping online, you can type in sea salt, and you can pull up jars that are labeled sea salt that have more chemicals in them than the table salt in the canister that you maybe grew up using at your house. And so looking at the ingredient level labels local, real, you'll find a lot better products than just, grabbing a salt, even if it's a sea salt off your shelf at the grocery store.
Let's take a minute to talk about some of the sponsors and brands who support the show.
What are you thinking?
I was thinking about Carnivore Bar. What are your thoughts on Carnivore Bar?
I mean, it's unbelievable. It's an unbelievable product. We were lucky enough to have the founder, Philip Meese, on the show a few months ago, and he was able to send us a bunch of product when we started the relationship and absolutely loved it. I mean, it's a minimum ingredient product, beef, tallow, salt, and then they do have a honey flavored option as well, but it's so nice to have a bar that's like 3 to 4 ingredients. And like when you're following a carnivore diet, it's really tough to find products that are in line with that specific diet,
Yeah, for me, it kind of hits like the holy trinity of what you're looking for when you're looking for food. So it's nutrient dense, it's convenient, and it tastes great. And as you said, most people who are trying to eat healthy, the convenience factor is kind of a tough part. So just being able to have something you can grab on the go, know that you're going to have that nutrition for the day, it's huge.
Yeah, and we were lucky enough, we got to actually see their factory too in Missouri, and they're just doing things the right way. I love how they offer an option for like carnivore purists where it's just beef, tallow, salt. And then they also have an animal-based option too. If you do want a little bit of sweetness, a little bit of variety, they have the honey in that option. And they're just people that are doing things the right way. They're very mission focused. They're carnivores themselves. And, we're always on the go. We're traveling. We've taken a bunch of flights together. To have a bar that has 30 grams of fat too, like that's huge from an energy density standpoint, right?
Yeah, he checks all the boxes, or the company checks all the boxes. And I just think the fact that they're sourcing from a regenerative farm as well, and Joyce Farms, just a win-win.
100%. So Carnivore Bar. So we got the affiliate link, and then it's code MAFIA for 10% off.
And then another one of our sponsors, one of our favorite farms, Holy Cow. What they're doing at Holy Cow is pretty remarkable. The relationships that they've built in the industry and how long they've been doing the grass-fed, grass-finished regenerative model is really innovative. They were one of the first people to be doing that and supplying whole foods early on. Just a great community farm, and also just the product is something that speaks for itself.
Yeah, I think number one, to your point, Harry, they're just incredible people. We got to hear them speak at the Beef Initiative conference in Colorado. We had never met them before, but just hearing Warren's story where they were following a standard American diet, he had had a heart attack, and they were just looking for answers of like, how can we actually get healthier? Do I need to be dependent on medication? And they started changing their diets to incorporating more animal foods, and he completely reversed those symptoms of his stroke. And now they're just doing things the right way. They're grass finishing their beef. They're incorporating incredible practices. They have great relationships with the animals, and they're very passionate about just like connecting directly with the customer and also educating their customer on grass finished beef.
Yeah, and I think the best part is too, they're shipping nationally and trying to reach a bigger audience. So being able to not only supply beef nationally, but also educate people on the quality of good, clean, whole foods is just, it's an incredible mission.
How much do you love their beef bacon, by the way? I know that's your go-to.
Dude, it's one of the best things I've ever tasted.
It's that good.
No, honest to God, it's so good.
Holy cow.
Yeah. One of the other farms that supports us is Perennial Pastures, another regenerative farm out of San Diego. Our experience with Kevin Munoz, the owner, we had him on the show, a young first-generation rancher who's really empowered by this movement of regenerative agriculture and really wants to be a leader in the space. I think our conversation with him was so insightful just in terms of how mission focused he is and how he really thinks about his farm as a business and wanting it to be here 50, 100 years down the road, even though he's just the first generation of it. And I think just being able to spend time with him out in San Diego was kind of the perfect indication of that, where we got to go have a meal with him at his house, hang out with his wife and kids. Like, what an amazing person. And I think his mission focus around raising really high quality beef and restoring nutrients to the soil is just one of those rare missions that I think everyone can get around.
Yeah, he has such a commitment to really feeding the local community in San Diego, in the San Diego County first and foremost, but he's also passionate about feeding the community around the country. So I know they've invested a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of resources to being able to order beef in bulk on their website. So I know that they now offer quarter, half, whole cows directly off the website. They have that great ancestral blend ground beef product. So it actually has organ grinds mixed into the ground beef. So you're getting the benefits of like an ounce or so of organ meat, but because it's in the ground beef, you really can't taste it at all. And I think to your point, Harry, just another amazing person. Kev was someone that he was following a paleo diet in college and started realizing, wow, when I nourish my body with real foods, I feel amazing. Had a really successful stint in tech, but realized that there was just something else that he was passionate about. So he's one of those rare cases where, he put his money where his mouth is, and he's a first generation farmer, just, bootstrapping this thing, raising money, and just so passionate about feeding the community. Just an amazing guy.
Yeah, absolutely. What are your thoughts on organ supplements, and what do you think about the company that supports our podcast, Optimal Carnivore?
Such a good question, man. I think organ meat is something that's gained a ton of notoriety the last few years, and for good reason. I don't want to speak for you, but I think both of us have had a ton of benefits just incorporating organ meats into our diet. I would say that, we definitely prefer the raw source of organs, where we'll just, chop up some liver and some heart, and, there are different ways to prepare it. I think the raw source is the most nutrient dense, but we're fortunate that there are companies like Optimal Carnivore that exist that freeze dry organ capsules, so you can actually take them on the go. There are a ton of times where we're traveling where we're not going to have access to raw organs. So I can throw a little Ziploc bag together of Optimal Carnivore and be good to go. And I think 6 pills is an ounce of organs, which is like the daily recommended amount that will give you a lot of those really good quality vitamins in there. So that's kind of how I think we've been using it. Did I miss anything there?
No, I think the fact that it just makes organs accessible to people. And I think that organs are generally just a food group that are underutilized when it comes to eating nose to tail. And the nature's vitamin is a perfect name for these organ foods. And I think a lot of people are pretty, in the mainstream, object to eating organ meats. But when you put it in a pill form that doesn't taste bad, it's convenient, you can put it in your backpack, it makes things a lot easier. And I also think that just generally these brands Optimal Carnivore is focused on making people healthier, which is just such a strong mission. And, I think liver capsules is a great way to get people thinking about their health differently.
100%. There's probably someone that's listening to this right now, and you're interested in organ meats, but the taste might make you a bit squeamish. You feel strange about eating raw foods. Maybe you cook liver and you don't like it. Maybe it has a metallic taste. I think that's also where the organ capsules play such a great role, is that you're still getting that nutrient density, but you're getting it in a very convenient capsule-like format, and it just takes away any of that squeamishness that you might have to the taste. It's just a great product. And also Richard, who runs Optimal Carnivore, he's started listening to the show really early on, and he's built his own organ supply chain and is just doing things the right way and really trying to support the right people in the space. So just proud to be associated with them, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for listening. Now we're going to go back to the show. Is there a particular reason why these other trace minerals attach themselves to salt? Like you mentioned magnesium, potassium, and those are essential minerals. So it's interesting to me that those bind with salt and are like a source of all these minerals that we need.
Yeah, it's an ionic bond. And so if you look at chloride, or chlorine. Chlorine is a deadly gas, right? It was used in the gas chambers. Chlorine gas is deadly. If you have a hot tub, you've got to be really careful with the chlorine. Chlorine is bad. Sodium is equally problematic. One pure sodium element, if you had pure sodium and one drop of water falls on pure sodium, it violently explodes. It's very basic and it's really caustic. Extremely so. And chlorine is very acidic and also quite deadly. But because they both have an ion that they're missing or that they have extra, those two will come together in a 1-to-1 bond, and they're electronically bound together. And what's, I think, so beautiful about sodium and chloride is we know sodium is important because of the sodium potassium pump. And sodium ions in our body are essential. You can never eat pure sodium. Chlorine is the same way. Chlorine is essential. Actually, chlorine is chloride is the forgotten nutrient. People focus on sodium, and they forget about chloride. And chloride is so important in our bodies. And because of nature, because of deity, however you look at, I think the beauty of human life is our bodies will eat something that's bound together in a very safe form, sodium and chloride. The body, through electrolysis, breaks those apart. The sodium becomes part of the sodium potassium pump. The chloride is used in digestion. A lot of people will switch to a low salt diet because they heard from their grandmother that salt was bad for them. And the first thing that goes to pot is digestion, because our bodies use hydrochloric acid to digest our food. Well, we don't eat hydrochloric acid. Our bodies generate it with hydrogen from the water and from chloride, from sodium chloride, potassium chloride, magnesium chloride, these other complex electrolytes that our body magically knows how to process. So anyway, I kind of went on a tangent there, but I get excited about salt.
No, it's great, and we're learning a ton too. I think we've mentioned to you, it's like we've done so much talk about carnivore and different aspects of the food system, and we've touched on salt, but this deep dive is amazing, and it's really interesting too, Darryl. And I'm sure you've seen it. This is interesting. It's like in the carnivore community, there's almost like two sects of the carnivore community, where there's one that says, look, if you're going carnivore, if you're going low carb, you need to keep your salt levels, your sodium levels really high. So there's like a certain threshold of salt that they recommend. And then there's also a sect of carnivores that believes in not salting your meat, which I think is really interesting. And it seems like those people are doing really well. I think that's like the camp that Amber O'Hearn falls into. But we've just found, like anecdotally, we're both like pretty salty sweaters. We do a lot of endurance stuff. And the more salt we take in from a good source, the better that we feel. So I'm just curious your perspective on that, because I'm sure you've seen both of those camps.
Yes, I have. And I'm two things. First, I would say we need to listen to our bodies, because I do think through the process of evolution, through genetics, through our history, our bodies do need different levels of salt. Fortunately, our kidneys, a healthy kidney. Now, if you're on dialysis, forget everything we're saying today, because if you're in kidney failure, your kidneys are primarily responsible for processing sodium. And a healthy kidney can process about 4 ounces of salt a day. This is a massive amount, which is why when you go to the hospital, you'll get an IV bag. An IV bag of saline, like a 1 liter bag, actually has more sodium in it than the daily recommended allowance of sodium. They don't tell you that, but if you are in the hospital and you're hooked up to an IV bag, you're getting more sodium out of that IV bag than is the daily recommended allowance. But again, our bodies are processed to digest sodium. And so, but equally, I think each of our bodies probably have different levels. If you're in a hot yoga studio, if you're a firefighter, if you are an ultra runner, I know you guys do a lot of ultra type events, your body is sweating. Our bodies, we don't sweat distilled water. We don't sweat tap water. Your tears are salty. Your sweat is salty. Your urine, I wouldn't suggest you taste it unless you have to, but it is also salty. And so our bodies are flushing salt all the time, every day. That's all we get rid of. And so our bodies need salt. The more you sweat and the more you're burning and cleaning your system, the more salt you're going to need. And so with that said, in carnivorism, a lot of the salt, sodium that somebody might get outside of additional salt sources that our ancestors would have sourced would be coming from blood. And so if you are eating very, very rare meats and organ meats, you are getting higher sodium than somebody who is eating something that they've just baked the tar out of, because you have just lost a lot of that sodium that's in the animal's blood that then you're consuming. And early men would do that. Early men, they would harvest an animal and they would immediately eat the heart and the organ meats, and they would drink blood from the animal because they felt it gave them life, knowing that life was the blood of the animal. And so the more rare you're getting, you are getting more sodium in that rare, outside of jerky and things like that. So I think there's a couple of factors there. Myself, I find that I digest the meat better when I have salt with it. But I know there's others that, find that they prefer a very heavy meat-based diet. The one thing I would say, and you probably noticed this with yours as well, is meat takes a higher amount of water to digest than other food sources. And so when you are switching to a high meat diet, drinking additional water is increasingly important because the body does require more water to digest meat than it might, some vegetable.
Yeah, I've absolutely noticed that when I started switching over to a high meat diet, my body was just couldn't hold water nearly as well as it usually did with more carbohydrates in it. So I think that's a really good point. Darryl, is there any practical advice that you would give to the mom walking through the grocery store and looking for spices or salts, because it seems like an underappreciated and less talked about area of nutrition, but such a common thing that people are putting on foods that can actually, like we've even heard there's just like a lot of malpractice almost when it comes to some of the processing of spices. And I would just love to get your perspective on just quality when it comes to picking out really good spices and salts for, making your dishes taste better.
I love that one because, as you say, it's often overlooked. I'd say two things. One, if you switch over to a natural salt, something like our product Redmond, or there's some other good brands out there, the first thing you'll notice if you taste them side by side, that the natural salt, like real salt in this case, is a lot sweeter. If you taste them side by side, a processed salt has a sharp and bitter aftertaste to it.
Yes.
And so some of the seasonings, salts and the seasoning and the flavorings out there, they will add sugar often to that product to overcome the bitterness of the salt. And so if you get a natural, say onion or garlic salt, and you get a freeze-dried organic garlic clove, and then you add naturally sweet salt to it, the flavor is way stronger, and it's actually have a sweet overtone instead of an overly salty overtone to it. And so when you start to eat real, then you'll actually, it will clean, the products will get cleaner as you go, because you don't need some of those additional additives to make it taste good, because good, clean, natural salt actually tastes sweet. And in fact, on my desk at work, I've actually got a a dish of salt crystals. And if I'm feeling a sugar craving, if I feel like I might need something, sugary, one of the first things I'll do is just put a piece of salt in my mouth.
Interesting.
And oftentimes that salt has a very sweet flavor, and it's satisfying. And so as somebody maybe switching over to more of a carnivore diet, or maybe they're doing some intermittent fasting and they're going through these cravings that they think they're craving sugar, oftentimes just a clean salt crystal will satisfy that craving, because over time our bodies have forgotten what to listen to their own cravings. And so sometimes when we're really craving salt, our bodies think we're craving a bag of potato chips, or they think we're craving, French fries or donuts. What the body's really craving is water and salt and maybe some fat. And so I think as we listen to our bodies, we can get kind of cleaner products. Back to the salt aisle question, because when you switch to a natural salt, it's really flavorful and sweet. So some seasoning companies will add flavor enhancers like MSG or monosodium glutamate as a flavor enhancer. Or if you have freeze-dried garlic, in our example, and good clean salt, it actually tastes stronger and sweeter than even if you put, some chemical enhancer with it. And so I think going back to reading the label for the person in the grocery store, and I alluded to earlier, there were 3 questions I think that you should ask. And whether you're, buying a seasoning, maybe you want a Cajun seasoning, or maybe you want to just to get a jar of salt. There's just 3 questions. And so the first one is, who is producing it? Today, if you walk into a big box store and you buy a jar of salt, whether it's pink salt, red salt, sea salt, doesn't matter. It's oftentimes hard to know actually who is producing that product, because it might be a store brand, but if you can find out who's producing the salt, that's the first question. The second one would be, where is it coming from? Oftentimes today our food goes through so many hands, and you walk in and you buy a jar of salt and you have no idea where the salt came from. Did it come from the San Francisco Bay, the Gulf of Mexico, the Sea of Japan, after the nuclear meltdown? I think these are really important questions. If you are if maybe you're getting a nice steak, where is it coming from? Is it getting shipped, from halfway around the world, or did it come from the guy 2 farms down that you can, know actually where our food comes from? Because if we know who's producing it, if we can look the farmer in the eye and ask her, hey, what is this? What's the process? If we know the field or the salt deposit that it came from, then we can ask the third question, which is, what's the process? Has anything been added? And has anything been taken out of the product? And so knowing the source, knowing the producer, and knowing what's happened, or knowing the process, I think those 3 questions, whether we're getting steak or cheese or salt or garlic, I think those 3 questions will give us a lot better product, and it'll help us, again, kind of full circle, do what you recommend. It'll help us eat local, because it's a whole lot easier, when possible, to buy from a farmer that's in our county or city or neighborhood than it would be to find a product that's halfway around the world. It helps us eat real, because we can find out, was the cow grass fed? Was it full of hormones? All of those important questions. What was the diet? Is a cow getting fed bone meal and all kinds of nasty stuff, or is it been able to, forage? And then if you're cooking yourself, then you get to add your own seasonings and make sure that you're not getting some mystery spice that, you really don't know any of those things on.
Definitely. Darryl, that's such good practical advice. Appreciate you giving us that 3-step walkthrough. You reminded me, I've been seeing a big push online for companies that are advertising that they're microplastic free salt. Can we maybe touch on what that means for the consumer?
Great question. So years ago, a lot of the bath and body type companies, they started to add fun stuff to the shampoos. So you might go buy a bottle of shampoo. It smells delightful, and you see these little teeny beads in it. Or you might buy a hand soap, and as you pump it out, it's got these, fun little beads. Well, those beads are microbeads that were added to a lot of products for several years. People didn't think much of it. And it was a way to add volume. It gave some texture. It was an exfoliator. It supposedly did all of these great things. Well, every drain, as we learned in Finding Nemo, leads to the ocean. And so all of a sudden, all of this seafood, when they started to open these fish up, they noticed these fish were full of these little microbeads. And then because of, unfortunately, our oceans today, we humans haven't been the best stewards of the planet that we live on. You go out to these oceans, there's these big floating rafts of plastics. And over time, these plastics continue to break down. And as they break down, now you go into some of the beaches around the world, and there are just bits and pieces of plastic just covering the whole beach because of these plastic water bottles and plastic jugs and all of this stuff that's over time ended up out in our oceans. And so several years ago, there was a big push environmentally to stop manufacturers from putting all of these microbeads in their formulas. And they've actually been outlawed now. So in the US, you won't find any of these products that have microbeads that are built into the formula, because once they're in there, they're there forever and they just end up in the oceans. And then in addition to the microbeads and the plastics that are out there, water is the universal solvent. And so although Exxon Valdez happened long before you guys were even alive, there's remnants of the Exxon Valdez oil spill that's now all the way down, even though it was in Alaska, is now all the way down the coast into the South America, because water is the universal solvent. it didn't take a whole long time once the Japanese disaster happened that bits and pieces of the facility, as well as radiation, was coming across into the coast of California. And so a lot of companies today that are especially sea based, whether it's salmon, cod, whatever it is, they're going through to certify that their food, that the seafood that they're selling is plastic free, because of these, as these salmon are out eating whatever it is in the ocean, these microbeads are now ending up in the fish. And so they'll certify that, hey, if you buy a salmon steak, you're not going to get bits of plastic in your steak. Because a lot of salt still to this day comes out of the oceans, then they want to certify that the salt from the current ocean is plastic free. So one of the beauties of an ancient seabed, the seabed that was laid down during the Jurassic era, that the real salt comes from, is this seabed here is 100, according to geologists, is 150 million years old. Wow. So this salt was an arm of the Arctic Ocean during the Jurassic era, and pollution in the Jurassic era might have been some volcano dust, or it might have been the T-Rex walking through the salt marsh, but pollution looked a lot different back then. And so one of the reasons that some people will choose a crystal salt, like the Bolivian pink salt or the Pakistan pink salt or the U.S. Utah pink salt, is because all of those deposits were laid down eons before we were dumping anything into our oceans. Now, if you were to take your shaker of salt, if we were to take this salt that's 150 million years old and we crush that down to microscopic particles, there's going to be absolutely zero plastics in there, because the salt itself was created millions of years before plastic was. If you were to go home and you take this shaker now and you use it for a few weeks and you take the lid off and pour a little bit into your soup and you make some bone broth, and then you were to test this shaker, you won't find any microbeads from the salt or plastic particles. But every time you take that lid off, that lid has little grooves in it because it's a screw-on lid. And so just by putting that lid on, you are creating potentially a very minute shard. If there's any friction as you put that lid on, or you over crank it because you're super strong, all of those things can create little microscopic things, right? But it's very different from what you would have versus the ocean, that we have all of the potential issues that our oceans deal with today. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Darryl, I'm curious. So Redmond's based out of Utah, and I recently went on a trip to Moab and was basically blown away by the landscape there, and come to figure out that Moab was basically like the bottom of the ocean at one point. And so I'm curious about learning a little bit more about the history of Redmond, and just like, why is Utah a great place for a salt mine? Because it seems like there's a lot of places to get salt from. So why Utah?
I thought you would never ask. Outside of salt, I think geology is the next coolest thing. So if we went back 150 million years ago, Utah was at sea level. Right now, Utah, depending on where you're at in the state, is upwards of maybe 5,000 feet. So it's part of what we call the Great Basin, because it's been pushed up. And if you look at the Rocky Mountain West in general, you have the Rocky Mountains that are running, through through Utah. You have the Sierra Nevadas, and it's all been pushed up and elevated. So if you look at Utah, the next time you come skiing out this way, there's three big mountain ranges in Utah. There's the Ochres, which are kind of on the west side of Salt Lake. You have the Wasatch Range, which is where the ski resorts are. Then you have the Henrys that are over on the other side. And so, but if you look at the way Utah is created, these mountain ranges, they've been pushed together because these tectonic plates, the big Wasatch Fault, has been pushed up like this. So if we went back 150 million years ago, Pangaea, the supercontinent that we learned about in elementary school, was still starting to pull apart. And as the supercontinent pulls apart, the Arctic Ocean floods down in the central part of the U.S., leaving a massive body of salt water because it was kind of a depression. And so the water flooded in. The sea that was left was called the Sundance Sea. If you go to Wikipedia and look up the Sundance Sea, you'll see what geologists think this empiric sea, meaning it was a shallow inland sea that flooded through a series of times. Well, as this sea was put in, again, seawater being about 2 to 3% salt, geologists believe that back before the dawn of time, the primordial seas were about the same as our bodies, about 1% salt. And then over the years, it got increasingly salty through runoff and things like that. But the seawater floods in and leaves this massive inland sea covering all of Utah, parts of Colorado, Montana, Arizona, Nevada, massive inland sea. And then the ocean or the mountain ranges pushes up and cuts off this seabed. Well, over time, just like in a current evaporation pond, that salt starts to settle off. And eventually this salt is about 1/8 of a mile thick and covering a 3 or 4 or 5 state area. Now, Utah was 50 miles wider apart. And so as the plates start to shift and push, this inland sea gets buried through volcanic activity and sediment. And now this inland sea is underground. And now its heat and pressure starts to push this deposit up. And salt under pressure will buckle, just like the mountain ranges have buckled. And so if you come down to this little town in Utah called Redmond, named after these 3 red mounds, Red Mound, there is a salt deposit that was originally horizontal, meaning layer of salt, layer of salt, layer of salt, like that, like a sedimentary deposit. Under heat and pressure, this salt deposit now sits like this because it's been pushed up like that. So the deposit is about 1/4 mile wide, 3 miles long, and at 5,000 feet, it turns and goes horizontal again, which makes sense because Utah is 5,000 feet up and the old seabed is 5,000 feet deep. So this deposit sits like this, 1/4 mile wide, 3 miles long, and 5,000 feet deep. And back in the 1950s, my grandfather and his brother had a farm that just so happened to be positioned right about like that on this salt deposit. And it wasn't doing all that well in the 1950s. There was a big drought. The farmers were struggling, and they needed something to do to feed the kids and to keep the families going. And so they knew there was salt under their farm because the Native Americans had actually harvested the salt long before the early settlers came into the valley. They had long moved on since then, but there were remnants of where this salt had been pushed to the surface that the deer and the local wildlife had actually been accessing. And so they knew there was salt under the farm. And so they got a big piece of rebar and started pounding it down through their field to see where it got closest to the surface. And so in World War II, my grandfather was a business manager and a riveter for McDonnell Douglas in California. And his brother was a miner at Kennecott, the really big copper mine here in Utah. And so even though they were farmers, they had some mining experience and some business experience. And so they decided to go into the salt business and initially sold the salt to local farmers because they knew animals need salt to live. If you're a farmer and you don't give your cows access to salt, birth defects, hoof rot, all kinds of things start to go wrong. And so they sold it initially to farmers. They also sold it to the local municipalities because salt, as you know, here in Utah in the Mountain West, it will melt ice off the roads. And so they would sell it to the roads, municipalities to keep the roads safe. And then they would eat it themselves. If you think about food in the 1950s, it was all stark white, processed sugar, processed flour, processed salt. And so when they started selling this salt, it was this pink, rosy, dirty color. And they thought, well, nobody's going to want this for their kitchen because it doesn't look clean and pure like salt and sugar and flour. And so they ate it themselves, but they didn't sell it at all. Well, in the 1970s, the health food movement started to gain some traction. And there was a nutritionist that came through and got a tour of the salt mine. We didn't think anything of it because we give tours to a lot of people. And a few months later, we started getting these phone calls about people wanting to buy our salt from out of state. And apparently this guy went back and wrote an article and published it across the US. It said, hey, the healthiest, tastiest salt in the US comes from Redmond, Utah.
Wow.
And so we started getting all of these phone calls, and we didn't sell it for health food stores. We were selling it for cows and for roads. So the family sat down and said, okay, if we're going to sell this to a health food store, we got to have a different name than just Redmond salt, or, cow salt or salt for your cows. And so they had this little marketing meeting, my dad and my grandpa and uncles, and said, okay, what do we call this? It's not processed salt. It's not half salt. I don't know. It's just real salt. And so that's kind of how the Real Salt name was born. Kind of seemed silly at the time, but now that everybody's realizing that a lot of food isn't real, it turned out to be a pretty ingenious product name.
That's an amazing story. It's also fascinating too, how back in the day, this like bleached white color was a sign of purity, where now we've really come away to the fact that that true pink color that you're talking about, that's an indication that it's actually real salt and real food that you should be consuming. I'm sure that's really interesting to you.
It is. And I think that all food in general is that way. If you look at salt in nature, salt, whether it's our brand or somebody else's, it should look like a snowflake, meaning that every crystal should look different. If you pour the salt out of your shaker and it looks like it is all come out of a little mold and it is perfectly shaped, perfectly beady, you're going to know that's not real. Mm-hmm. And if you go to a grocery store and let's say you're going to buy an apple, and all of a sudden every single apple looks like this almost Snow White and Seven Dwarfs, like perfect apple. There's not a mark. You've got to think, man, something is not right here. Because I've seen a lot of apple trees in my life, and every tree I've ever seen does not create these apples that look like they were painted or that came out of a mold.
Yeah.
And so I think food is the same way. And it's kind of funny, it's the meat podcast. If you're a farmer, or if you've ever harvested an animal and you cut a steak off yourself, maybe you go hunting and you have a nice venison steak, that doesn't look anything like a lot of the meat that you might see in the grocery store. And if you make hamburger out of your own cow from your farm, and you go in and you look at the red colored hamburger in a grocery store, it's like never the 20. They are so different. And oftentimes people don't stop and think, well, why in nature does meat look like this? And then why, when I go buy it from a grocery store, it looks like this? Or why does an apple look like this on an apple tree? And yet when I go to the store, they all look like this. And why does salt in nature look non-perfect? It depends on how you define perfection, but yet you go and buy processed salt and it looks like it's perfect. And anyway, I think that definition of perfect and what it's beautiful has been changed unhealthily over time.
Yeah. It's almost like the non-perfection is an indicator that it's actually healthy and actually real. So that's cool to explore. Darryl, something I wanted to mention to you, I think we talked about this a little bit before we hit the record button, but I was mentioning how both Harry and I have used your salt for a few years, pretty much since I started going low carb and carnivore, which was like right around the early part of 2019. And it's interesting, right? With a lot of these products, you have like Keto Certified, Paleo Certified. There's all these like official designations that companies can pay for. But what I was noticing with a lot of these brands that are popping up, they very proudly advertise that they're using Redmond Real Salt. It's almost like you guys have naturally become a certification for a true product. And I'm just curious, why do you think that is, or just how you think about that? Because I would imagine that's probably like a badge of honor to you all, where there's all these incredible brands that are popping up and they specifically want to incorporate your salt in their product.
I think there's probably twofold. And one, we're delighted that we get to be part of this movement. Our philosophy at Redmond is we want products that are simple, that are clean, and that are real. And we define real as in those three questions that I mentioned before. What's the process? Who's producing it? What have they been doing to it? Where's it from? And I think that just resonates, with this keto movement. I think another big part that we are lucky is that there are a lot of good salts from around the world, but there's very few of those that are right here in the U.S. And so as part of this eat local movement and trying to find products that are local, and again, I have no problems importing great products from around the world. I mean, there's some superfoods that we get from around the world, goji berries, and I mean, you name it. There's some good products that we import. But I also love this idea of eating local. And as much as possible, if you can get eggs from your neighbor that has a chicken coop in his backyard, or you can get eggs that are from, 3 states over, maybe you're not really sure where they came from, like, why not get the local? And with the keto movement and focusing on local here in the US, I think because we are a US supplier of an ancient sea salt, so we automatically remove some of the concerns about the microbeads, the plastics, the ocean issues. And because we're local here to the US, it's very lucky for us. And I would say the same thing. If we were having this podcast and we were in Bolivia, there is a really good salt that comes out of the Bolivian mountains. It's called an Andean pink salt. And if somebody from Bolivia calls me up and says, hey, Darryl, I'd like to import your salt down here to Bolivia. First, I would say, well, you realize you have a local source right there in Bolivia. And unless they're doing something to it, or unless for whatever political reasons you can't access that, then yeah, we'd be glad to help. But there's no reason to have all of those food miles to ship our product that's very similar to the Bolivian product all the way there if they can find something good, clean, and local. And I would say the same thing with eggs. I love, I think eggs are great for us, and I know everybody has their own opinion on eggs, but I think they're healthy. And if I can get them from Tammy, who lives just across town from me, and her chickens are in her backyard and into the field, or I can go to the grocery store and get an egg that I'm not really sure where it came from, what the chicken ate, why would I do that? Even if I have to pay a little bit more to Tammy, I like Tammy, and I think it's doing good things for the neighborhood. And so I think salt's the same way. And I think we're, as a U.S. ancient seabed supplier, not only do I think we're trying to do it right, but we also have the location and the history of the deposit that are kind of factors that maybe give us a leg up, and maybe an unfair advantage to some degree, because, whether it was serendipity or luck or divine intervention that this salt deposit was here in Utah, I think we're grateful for why ever it's here. We're grateful that it is.
Darryl, do you guys have an idea of how abundant your guys' salt mine is? Meaning, like, how much is there that you guys have access to now?
Great question. And one of the questions we do get is sustainability, because the salt deposit does not regenerate. It's from an ancient seabed. Now, it's a big seabed, again, 3 miles wide, or a quarter mile wide, 3 miles long, 5,000 feet deep. In that 5,000 feet, we've gone down about 600 to 700 feet in that deposit. And we've taken about 30 to 40% of the material in that first 600 feet. And the rest of it is structure. So the deposit, when you guys come out sometime, I'll give you a tour, but it's almost like an underground parking garage where the tunnels are kind of stacked this direction, right on top of each other. And so there's a lot of salt that's still there. So we could stop mining any deeper and just extract salt doing a retreat or an open pit, and we would have 60% more salt than we've taken in the last 50 years. But we've done some seismic testing, and we've worked with the geologists that work with us and our mine engineers. And the estimates are that the salt deposit will last another 800 to 900 years. And so we've got plenty of salt to put on the steaks for the next little while.
Oh yeah, we love to hear that. Yeah. And Darryl, so you guys have the original product, which is just pure salt. I know you make a garlic salt, which is delicious. We cook with that a lot. What other types of salt do you guys offer?
So the main is just the salt. Great place to start. We do have a line of seasonings. So we have some with garlic, onion, a seasoning blend, a taco one. We also do a line of smoked salts. So if you're a fan of smoked meats, one of the challenges with some smoked flavor and smoked seasoning is the companies will use a liquid smoke, or they'll use some chemicals to make it taste like smoke. Fortunately, with salt being hygroscopic, again, it absorbs smells and things very well. So we actually take the salt and smoke it like you would if you were smoking some meat out in your backyard, and the salt crystals absorb that smell and that flavor. And so if you're a fan of smoked flavor, we do have a line of smoked salts, kind of fun. You can put it on anything you're cooking. It's great for fish and for meats, great for even vegetables. If you're doing a light zucchini, it's something like that. It gives a nice smoky flavor to whatever you're eating. In addition to the more culinary side, we also have an electrolyte drink side. And so we have a product that we call Relight, as in re-electrolyte. And there's a lot of different varieties of that. Years ago, I would give classes to PTAs, soccer moms, and on the importance of salt and nutrition. And one of the things I would suggest is, throw out the chemical purple, pink sports drinks and just make your own. And you can take a quart of good, clean water, a quarter teaspoon of real salt, a squeeze of lemon, and you've just made an amazing sports drink for pennies on the dollar. Now, if you want to still do that, it's a great way to, you're going for a run or hot yoga, quart of water, quarter teaspoon of salt, squeeze a lemon, and you're great. If that's not super convenient, we do have this line of products called Relight. And in addition to the sodium chloride, and that's the one, and the trace minerals.
I've got the blueberry lemonade pre-workout. It's literally just your salt, electrolytes, and BCAAs. I've been using it for probably a month and a half, and it's been awesome. And our buddy gave this to us a month and a half ago. I didn't even realize that this was your company too. It's awesome.
Yeah. And so the nice thing about, using salt as a pre-workout, or, a lot of times, people will try to go to these energy drinks today, and a lot of those energy drinks, yeah, they have some caffeine in them and some fluids, but they don't have the electrolytes that we also need. And so we have a Relight that has caffeine in it that you could mix up in a bottle of water. It's clean. It's got, salt. It's got some electrolytes in it. It's got a little bit of clean caffeine from coffee and green tea. And it's a good, clean, natural boost that also has some electrolytes. And so kind of a fun product. And then we have some cosmetic products as well. We do a toothpaste that's salt and clay based. We have some like a facial mud that we do. So a couple of fun, unique things. And sure appreciate you having me on today, guys.
Awesome. This has been so informative and such a great topic. I think that a lot of people are going to get really good value out of this, just in terms of thinking about where they're getting their salt from and just the importance of salt in the diet. So Darryl, really appreciate you coming on and just sharing your wisdom with us. This was great.
I have enjoyed it. Sorry, I kind of ramble sometimes, but I'd like to personally invite both of you to come out to Utah. If you're ever here, let us know. We can take you down and show you the salt deposit, and maybe go skiing while you're here.
Let's do it. We'll definitely take you up on that. And just such an informative episode, and appreciate all that you're doing, Darryl. Thanks so much.
You're very welcome. Thanks again.
Thanks.